One of the problems people have with the existence of God is how can there be an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God and yet be all this suffering that we see around us in the world? I mean, if he can stop this suffering, why doesn't he? And if he doesn't, I mean, doesn't that mean that he doesn't really love us enough? How do you think about that?
It's a very good question, and I think we ask that question in a variety of ways, which sometimes demands different types of answers. So sometimes we ask the question very personally about a situation we're in right now, and other times we ask the question more broadly: why do I observe the world I observe? And I think we have to be able to deal with both. I think on the first side of it, why do we observe the world that we see? The biblical narrative is, look, a loving God does create a loving world, and he gives around it the conditions it needs in order for love to be meaningful. Now, we often talk about, yes, we could have a loving world, but without any pain and suffering. But that's harder than we may think. God could have created a robotic world. He just pushes buttons, we do whatever he wants us to do. Well, if that's the case, then there would be no suffering. As a matter of fact, there would be no evil. Everything that happened because God wanted it to. However, if a loving God wants to create a loving world where we can experience and express love, we're now talking about God creating us in such a way that we have capacities to do things, and therefore capacities to withhold things that make evil and suffering a possibility in this world. And that is something that forms right is the very heart of the Christian answer. Now, there's something else as well, because it is a multi-layered question. We often want to draw a distinction between acts of moral evil that we see in this world, where human nature seems to have gone wrong, and acts of physical evil in this world, where there are natural disasters and nature seems to have gone wrong. But in both instances we feel, oh gosh, has something gone wrong? And therefore we're looking for an answer to both of those.
Yeah, I think this distinction between moral evil and natural evil is very important. But before we get into that, but didn't God know that the world is going to go wrong? I mean, he obviously knew that we would mess this up. Why did he create, even though we were going to, make a mess out of this world that he created?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. I think there are a couple of things I would say. First of all, we're told God doesn't create out of a sense of internal need. It's not like he's alone, he wants someone else, therefore he creates someone else. Because we're told that God actually exists in a set of living, loving relationships. So he creates out of those relationships. So I think that's number one. I think number two is we are told that actually God did know what was going to happen. But it's interesting, in the book of Revelation it says that before the foundations of the world were laid, the Lamb was slain. Now, that seems to be referring to the fact that God would come into this world and that God himself in the person of Christ would pay the price for what has gone wrong. So it's not just the fact that God chooses to create. God chooses to create, he chooses to give us capacity to love each other and therefore to withhold love from each other, to see evil come into this world. And he does it knowing what it will cost him to rescue such a world. Now, that's a much bigger deal, because the price that God himself is willing to pay to rescue and redeem a world that turns away from him isn't an insignificant price. It's going to cost him everything. He will give himself in the person of Christ.
So are you saying that it cost God this price to even create a world with free beings?
That's my understanding, is that it's not the fact that God created, things went wrong, and then he thinks, oh, what am I going to do? How do I rescue it? It seems to be that he wants to create a world in which love is capable. That seems to be a key element of being created in God's image, that we're capable of experiencing and expressing love. We don't live in a robotic world. We don't live in an automatic world. We live in this world where we can do this. But as soon as you create that as a reality, you're creating the possibility of something else, because those same agents can decide to act in a contrary way. And that's what we're told happened. We act in a contrary way, but even that act doesn't take God by surprise. He is not simply willing to create us, he is willing to pay this price to intervene and rescue us.
Considering the price that God had to pay and all this evil in the world, couldn't we argue that it was better for God not to create?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of force in that question. The way I sometimes think about this is, I have 3 children. They're aged at the moment 14, 12 and 9. And at the moment, they all think I'm a wonderful father and I enjoy a great relationship with them. But let's suppose they all grow up to hate me. They want nothing to do with me. They never want to speak to me. And even though I haven't done anything wrong, let's assume a scenario in which I'm largely innocent of any wrongdoing, they reject me and they never talk to me again. Now, let's suppose I knew that would be the case before I gave birth to them. Well, my wife gave birth, but I was involved. What would I do? Well, genetics tells me if I wait an extra month, I could have different children. I don't have to have those children, if depending on which month they're conceived will depend on who we actually get. So I may well think, well, I'm not going to have those three, I'll have a different three. So I could choose not to give them existence. Now here's my question, I guess, of this in relationship to God. Is it more loving that I would choose not to give someone existence, even though they may use the freedom I have given them to reject me? Or is it more loving the fact that I choose and am willing to give them existence, even though they will go ahead and do that? Does that make sense? Is it more loving, is annihilation more loving than allowing for existence? And I'm not sure that my action to decide not to have those children, not to give them existence, is a more loving act than what God has done in actually granting us existence, while also giving us this capacity. But I do agree it's a very, very deep, it's a very deep question. There's one other thing that Jesus says that I find very interesting, and we read also about it in the Bible, that this idea that somehow God loves us and wants us. A colleague of mine, Vince Vitale, who's a professor at Oxford University, sometimes uses this illustration. He says, look, let's supposing there's a world where he wants Wasim to exist. Well, Wasim only exists in a world where also his parents have come together. If Wasim's mother marries someone else, she may have children, she may even have sons, but she doesn't have Wasim. She will have a different son. Well, is it possible that God doesn't just simply desire any old world? He wants a world that has not just Wasim in it, but the other 6 billion people who are on the world right now, and not just them, but the generation before them, of 1 billion, and the generation before them of 500 million, and the generation before them. What if God is aiming for and wants a certain family of however many billion people it may eventually be? Maybe if that is the case, he would allow both the wheat and the weeds to grow up together, which is a parable that Jesus says. He says, look, if you plant the good seed, it grows up with weeds. If you pull the weeds out too soon, you also pull out the good plants and you kill them. So the farmer says, look, let both of them grow and then we'll separate them out. So is it possible that God also does allow a world to continue that has certain amounts of evils within it, because there's also other things in it which in his sight is good, and he wants that to grow and to flourish. And then there will be a final time where he will deal with that thing which is wrong as well. But at the meantime, he's allowing it to continue. So, and now, these are very, very big questions because they're raising huge, huge issues. And we sometimes think, oh, it would be lovely if God intervened 30 years ago and stopped this terrible thing happening in my family. And it's true, God could have done that. And I think God sometimes does intervene. But every time God does intervene, history is actually altered. So if you remove an intervention or you stick an extra one in, and then you wind the clock forward again, we don't end up with exactly the same world. And so some thinkers have thought about this, and they've said, well, maybe as God intervenes, the world is messed up, but maybe it would be even more messed up with less or more intervention. In other words, God is intervening in a certain way, to bring about a people whom he desires and also a world which he sees. And there will be a final reckoning to help sort this out.
I want to go back to something you said about moral evil and natural evil. And I want you to talk to me a little bit about the relationship between moral evil and natural evil, because you can understand how when I do something wrong, that is a moral evil in that sense. But how does it affect the natural world, and especially with things like natural disasters that are much bigger than any decision anybody can take, and that seem to be very independent of any decision that anybody has ever taken? What's the relationship between these two?
Okay, that's a very important question. I think sometimes we can draw a straight line between a moral decision and some form of natural suffering. So for example, if I'm drunk and I get in my car and I run you over, I cause physical suffering in you as a result of my moral act. Similarly, if I get drunk every night for the next 10 years and in 25 years' time die from kidney and liver failure, I experience pain and suffering. My family may experience pain and suffering in a physical sense and emotional sense, again through a moral choice. And there the line is less direct, but we can still see it. But we also know that there are some types of suffering where you can't just simply draw those straight lines. So Jesus was once asked the question of suffering about some people who were killed and their blood was mingled with the blood of their own sacrifices, which was a huge moral evil. And God says to the people, were they worse sinners than you? In other words, did this terrible thing happen to them morally because God wanted to punish them? No. Then he says, and there was a group of people on whom a big tower fell. Well, that's the problem of pain. That's natural evil. There's an earthquake, a tower fell on them and killed them all. And then Jesus said, were they worse sinners than you? And the answer is no. Well, if the answer is no to both of those questions, to draw a line from either their choice or someone else's choice to their suffering is wrong. Jesus himself says that that's not always the case. Now, he doesn't say they weren't sinners at all. He just says, look, they were no worse than anyone else. So it's true that we live in a world where sometimes we experience consequences that, in that sense, aren't anything to do with us. Now, I think we can understand that in two ways. One, that the things that we do affect the very fabric of the world in which we inhabit, and that the world we live in is fallen. In other words, the world that God first created is not the world we find ourselves in now, nor will it be the way the world would always be. So we're now in this time. I think that's an aspect, potentially, of it. I think the other side to it, which is just as interesting to me, is, okay, if that is the case, how then do we make sense of the suffering that we see, whether it's through natural disaster or moral evil? And again, I find something very interesting here as I read through the Bible. One, Jesus talks about a day of judgment to come. No one will get away with things morally.
It's a very interesting.
It is. It's a very interesting thing, but it means that, I mean, anyone who's experienced evil or seen evil and thinks people get away with it, it causes desperation because it seems so unfair. But actually, Jesus says, actually, look, no one gets away with it. Either they will pay on that day, or because of what I have done and because of my intervention, because of the price that I'm willing to pay on the cross, I will pay for it. But no moral evil is swept under the carpet. It is dealt with. And then there's also this promise of resurrection, of life to come. Well, that deals now with the physical side, the physical nature that seems to have gone wrong. This world isn't the only world that we have. So that means, for example, disease strikes down a mother's child when they're just a few weeks old. Well, where's the sense in that? Where's the meaning in that? I think if this world is the only world that we have, I think we'll have to conclude, well, that's just the way it is, and there is no meaning or significance to it. If it's the case that there is a world to come, and there is a resurrection, then that begins to change the equation. I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that we only live for a finite amount of time, but the world we inhabit is permanent. But actually the Bible teaches the reverse. We will live forever. We can either go forever to be with him, or we can go forever to be separated from him. And the world is temporary. But we live forever. It actually spins those two around. And that does put a different spin on how we relate to death. Because the question isn't how long will we live for, the question is how long will we live here before being somewhere else. Now
what you're saying is raising a lot of other big questions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think we'll have to tackle them separately as we go on, and we will do that. So could you just give me a short summary of what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure.
In a couple of sentences.
Yeah, I think The biblical narrative is that a loving God creates a loving world. He makes it possible for that world to experience and express love. But when we reject him and the way he has for us to live, we end up breaking ourselves. We feel a brokenness that we have. We see broken lives around us, and we live in a broken world. But God himself has his own heart broken in relationship to this. He weeps over what he sees, and he comes into this world, and he's broken for us on the cross. He takes the brokenness and the pain for that which we have done onto himself, making two things possible. One, forgiveness of moral evil, while also punishing moral evil on the cross. And two, the possibility of a new life to come, an entrance into that new life, where we might have experienced a new heaven and a new earth. So I think in a summary, that's how I see it.
Thank you.